This is usually the time in the program where I introduce the presenter, but tonight that presenter is me. I'm all you got. So we're trying a little something different this month. We're going to try this and see how it goes. What's happened over the course of this fall is we've had a lot of requests come in here to the office from all over the state, literally from the Louisiana-Texas border all the way down into the Big Bend region, different counties, different areas across the state asking us questions about setting up, creating, and organizing emergency services districts, ESDs. And we also were recently attending the County Judges and Commissioners Association conference like we do every year. We go to that conference every year and try to represent safety, try to represent ESDs, talk to the different county judges and commissioners that attend that conference about ESDs. Now, what we realized is, in talking with a lot of those folks, is a lot of them, even some county commissioners and county judges that have ESDs in their county, don't quite know all the facts about ESDs. And we're also going out to make presentations to some of these areas around the state that are thinking about setting up ESDs. And they're going to have their county judges and county commissioners there. So a lot of public information is needed about emergency services districts. Now, this is my long-winded way of telling you why we got here tonight. At our last safety board meeting, our board, one of our directors, Jim Carter, did a presentation that he did for his county commissioners about Denton County ESD. And I said, wouldn't it be great if SafeD had a presentation like that we could take to the public, and we just had it vetted and we had it constructed to where we could take it to the county judges and commissioners, general stakeholders in the community, people in the fire service who aren't in ESD, and just general members of the public, taxpayers, citizens, that explains what ESDs are. And so that's what we're doing tonight. So that brought us here. Now, what we want is we need your help, basically. What we want to do, and a lot of this information is going to be stuff for you, people who are active in the ESD world. A lot of this is going to be review for you. Now, hopefully some of this will be stuff that you haven't maybe seen before, stuff that you might learn. And that's great, and that's what we want. But we also need your help in creating this presentation. It's going to be a collaborative effort. What we want to do is we want to get your comments on what you think needs to go in to this presentation. I may miss something. I may have something completely wrong. I actually already had something wrong that one of our folks out there emailed in today and got me to change. That's the kind of stuff we need. It's a collaborative effort. It's the essence of what safety is and what safety does. And we hope at the end of the hour you might have learned something. You'll get an hour of credit for doing it, and you'll help us with the outreach about ESDs into the general community. This presentation is actually going to be made in the middle of November. I have to fly up to Northeast Texas, right on the Sabine River there, and give this presentation to a group of folks who are thinking about starting an ESD in a county that's never had ESDs before. So your work and your collaboration here is going to help us get the message out and get the right message out to those folks. We've had a version of this presentation in the past, but we want to take it and redo it and take it to you all and see what we need to improve, what we need to make better. So you guys can get in and tell me what, please, my feelings will not be hurt on this presentation. I need your input. So talk to us, and if we don't have time at the end of the presentation, email us in your questions or concerns or some input that you might have. So let's go ahead with that. Let's get started. Now I want to reiterate, this is ESDs, the basics. I'm just hitting the basic stuff here. Now John Carlton and Safety developed an ESD 101. Many of you have taken that. It's 2.5 hours long. It's an in-depth course. That's not what this is supposed to be. Kelly Carlton at our conferences does an ESD 201 about how an ESD works. She delves into even deeper topics like bidding, competitive bidding, open meetings, open records, ethics, stuff like that. A lot of you have taken her class at the conference. That's not what this course is. This is for the general public. I want to reiterate that. This is for people who either barely know about ESDs, or this is for people who barely know about ESDs, or know only the basics, maybe even barely know message out what an ESD basically is. Remember, this is the basics. So if I skip something or I don't get too in depth about something, that's why. I want you to try to put on your hat and say, what would I want my public or my ESD commissioners, or county commissioners, county judges, my local government officials, or my taxpayers to know about ESDs? And if you don't see it in this presentation, drop us a line. So hopefully with that incredibly long-winded explanation of what we're doing tonight, you're with me, and we're going to have a good exercise in a collaborative effort of building a presentation tonight. So thank you for being here. So let's get started with this presentation. I don't need any more of these because we're on to presentation. Here we go. What is an ESD? The very basics. An emergency services district and its emergency services district, ESD, are independent local governments. That's in italics for a reason. They're independent local governments with power to levy a tax and provide fire protection and or emergency services to the public. Now, that emergency medical service. Now, that's my definition that I sort of created. There's a lot of different definitions out there. I emphasize independent local governments. They are not a part of your county government per se. They are not a department of the county. The county commissioner's court has interaction with them, as we'll discuss ad nauseum tonight. But they are you as an ESD commissioner. ESDs are local governments that are independent. They're special districts. Texas is sort of the land of special districts. ESDs are political subdivisions of the state of Texas. They're very similar to a school district, an independent school district, which many of you have. That's a good way of telling the public to get in the right frame of mind. They're hospital districts. Library districts are somewhat similar. I stay away from talking about MUDs or other utility districts, developer districts, because those are kind of a different thing. And I also want to emphasize in this presentation that ESDs are grassroots entities. Very important to understand that they come from the citizens. We'll talk about that more in a slide in the future. So why do you create ESDs? Now, it's important to keep in mind the basic premise that we have here. The normal situation is a volunteer fire department in a lot of cases, or sometimes folks who are struggling with ambulance care, maybe in a rural area sometimes, or a fast-growing area that doesn't have municipal service, are struggling with funding. What you see is that emergency services, funding for emergency services is down, and there's no real way to get that up, because the usual way of raising funds is barbecues, bake sales, fish fries, maybe a silent auction or two. I'm sure a lot of you out there have done those, and that can be less than reliable. One of our ESDs, I know our old ESD chief talks about how he was making something like $7. Sometimes he was losing money on the barbecues that they put out because the support just wasn't there for that. Sometimes they can be beneficial, those fundraising events, but even if they are beneficial, you've got to remember you've got a small subsection of the public that's actually attending those. You have a small group of folks who are supporting emergency services that go to the entire population in that area. When an ESD or when a volunteer fire department gets sent out on a call, they don't check how much you donated at the last bake sale or the last barbecue. It's just not the way it works. Now, that has been tried in other areas of the country. You may have seen some headlines about some member-only volunteer fire department where they only respond to your call if you paid the membership dues. And you may recall seeing headlines about how that doesn't really work so well. And that's not a way that it generally is practiced in Texas. Usually our first responders respond to the emergency and they don't ask questions. They just try to save lives and save your property. So a brief history we're going to get into, and there won't be a test on this later, don't worry, you don't have to remember any of these dates, but it just gives you an idea of how we got to where we are. Now, in 1949, the farm block and the insurance companies, after suffering a lot of different property damage from fire, came together and said, we need some sort of way of supporting our first responders, our fire protection out in the field. We need to get some funding for these people that's reliable. So they created the Rural Fire Prevention District. Now that tax cap, that's a taxing entity very similar to what ESDs are today, but they were capped at 3 cents per $100 of property valuation. And the enabling statute was made in 1957. Many of you out there watching us tonight were originally RFPDs, and some of you may know that. Some folks in the state, unfortunately, think that they still are rural fire prevention districts. We'll get to that in a second. So what happened is that 3 cents worked for a little while, but in the 80s, people realized it needed to get stepped up a notch. And in 1987, the legislature passed, created essentially emergency services districts, and the tax cap was raised to a dime, 10 cents per $100 of property value. That enabling statute was put into the same year, and we'll talk more in a second about creating authorization laws versus enabling statutes. Now in 2003, and this was the part that I got wrong, I had it as 2001 in the original materials. I want to get a big thanks to Sarah out in Harris County ESD 13 for chiming in and letting me know. A big thanks to her. That's how this is supposed to work tonight. I had the wrong year, but it was 2003 we had an RFPD conversion. The upshot of it is the legislature converted all RFPDs to ESDs. So there were no more RFPDs. Now, however, it's important to know that the RFPDs were still capped at 3 cents. There was no automatic, okay, now you're an ESD, so you can go up to 10 cents. They're still capped at 3 cents unless you went out and that old rural fire prevention district, now that it's an ESD, held another election to say, will you authorize us up to 10 cents? Very important thing to remember. And we kind of went along nipping and tucking the laws until about 2011. We had Senate Bill 917, which was some landmark legislation in terms of ESDs. It was an omnibus bill that sort of, if it didn't overhaul ESDs and ESD law, it definitely changed a lot of the game. It increased accountability and oversight. A lot of that came from some things that were happening and showing up in the news that weren't so good for ESDs. A lot of legislators were becoming concerned, giving calls to SafeD, that we were having a lot of trouble, and ESDs were kind of under threat for a second there. We'll talk more about that in a second. And it consolidated all ESDs under one set of laws. That's kind of important for some of you out there. You may have heard about a different set of a different chapter of the Health and Safety Code. We'll talk about that in a second. You're all under the same laws now. So all of ESDs are under the same law. And let's talk about that law. Now, I talked earlier about creation legislation versus enabling legislation. Now, the Texas Constitution is where we get the authority to create ESDs. And that specifically is Article 3, Section 4080. You don't have to memorize that. That sets forth the general purposes, what an ESD is, what it can do. It also establishes that tax cap, that 10-cent tax cap, and that's important. Now, as many of you know out there, that tax cap being in the Constitution means you can't change it without a constitutional amendment, which means 2/3 of both houses of the Texas legislature, House and Senate, plus a statewide referendum. We're about to have, in about a week here, an election on many constitutional amendments. You'll see a lot of them, or a few of them at least, that are being talked about. To increase that 10-cent cap, it would basically take a constitutional amendment. That's been tried before, hasn't gone so well. I want to say one thing about that 10-cent cap. Now remember, that 10-cent cap was established in 1987, the same year my little brother was born. He's a man now. He's sitting out here helping us with this production. That 10-cent cap in 1987, that's equal to 21 cents. I just did the CPI inflation calculator. That's equal to 21 cents. So a dime in 87 would buy you 21 cents worth in 2015 money, but we haven't seen an increase. So a lot of folks are getting strapped by that 10-cent cap. We'll talk more about that in a second even. Now, when I say enabling legislation, Texas Health and Safety Code, Chapter 775. Now, this is the part that you need to know, and if you don't know it out there, I'm sure most of you do, but that's the one you need to really write down, because that's essentially, we've talked about running your ESD like a business in years past. ESDs operate according to Chapter 775 of the Texas Health and Safety Code. So those are your bylaws in a manner of speaking. It tells you what your powers are, what ESDs can and can't do, how you create an ESD. Most of what we're going to be talking about is set forth in Chapter 775. Some other laws that you have to be aware of that affect ESDs. In the Government Code, you have the Open Meetings Act and the Public Information Act. The PIA used to be called the Open Records Act. Open meetings, open records. You are a local government entity, a governmental entity. Your public officials as ESD commissioners. That means you're required to be bound by the Open Meetings and Open Records laws. You also are subject to truth and taxation requirements. There are different elections laws because ESDs can hold elections. There's also some things in the local government code that affect you because, again, you are a local governmental entity. So, going forward, I'm going to talk briefly about how you create an ESD. Remember, this is for our folks out there who don't know the creation process, and maybe a brush up for some of you out there who need a reminder, because there's some things in the creation process that can inform even how you act as an ESD commissioner. Now, how you create an ESD, it all begins with a petition. Now, you've seen a lot of petitions out there. If you're active on the internet, there's petitions all over the place being passed around. A petition is, in this case, we're talking about an official document. It begins the process. It originates with the citizens. Of all the talking I'm going to do here tonight, that is something that I want to get through. The ESD originates with the citizens. The citizens make that petition. You have 100 qualified voters and qualified voters means you're registered to vote and you own taxable real property in the proposed district. But that's it. It's not the legislature creating it. It's not your county government, your county commissioners by act creating a new ESD. You can only be created by the citizens coming together, a group of citizens saying, this is what we want. This is something we want to create. Here's where you name the district and you set the boundaries of the district. Now, a lot of people ask me, who decides what an ESD is? Well, whoever creates and writes this petition, that's pretty much where you decide what the boundaries are. You list them in the ESD. They're subject to a county commissioner's thing in a second that we'll talk about, but the boundaries of the district can be whatever you want it to be. They can be a county-wide district. You can propose that in your petition. Of course, you can't overlap existing ESDs, but anywhere you don't have an ESD, you can create an ESD, basically. And that's where it becomes your ESD. And you have to specify the services that are to be performed. You can make it a fire ESD. Some of you out there are only fire protection only ESDs. Some of you are EMS only ESDs. Some of you in your creation petition provide both. Now, if you're a fire and an EMS ESD, you can actually create overlapping ESDs. I didn't get into overlapping ESDs in this presentation. I thought that might be a little too much for tonight. I can get into it if you out there think that's something I should talk about. But again, you have to specify the specific services that you're going to put, that the ESD is going to provide. Now, municipal consent. Now, this is a big deal. Some of you out there have cities in your ESD. Creating an ESD is subject to municipal consent. If the ESD you're proposing, remember, you propose the boundaries in that petition. If the petition covers city limits of a city or an ETJ of a city, the extraterritorial jurisdiction is what that stands for, then you have to get municipal consent, and there's a process for doing that. I'm not going to get into that. I've done that in past presentations about creating an ESD, and I see eyes rolling back in the head. I just need to get out there that municipal consent is something that's a problem or an issue that needs to be dealt with. There's a process in the law for getting it. If it's a specific process to an ESD that I'm talking to in the future, we can talk more about that. But for tonight, I'm just gonna keep it simple. So after you have that petition, you present it to the County Commissioners Court. And then the next step, it's on to that County Commissioners Court. And this is where the County Commissioners Court gets involved. They have to officially receive it. It has to be received by the county judge. You have to file it with the county clerk. And then they have to hold a public hearing on that petition. Now that public hearing is at the next regular or special meeting after the petition is filed, and the hearing is subject to notice requirements, and those are prescribed in the law. When the county commissioner's court then holds the hearing, and this is all at the county level right now, this is where the ball is essentially in their court for this part of the process. The county commissioner's court is tasked with approval or rejection of the petition, so that they get to say yay or nay. We've seen this before, and I will tell you I've seen the county commissioner's court reject a petition before. That was actually for an overlapping ESD, but I've seen it happen. It's usually if you have the county commissioner's court and the county judge on your side and you have everyone informed and there's understanding that there's a need there, then then it's not such a big obstacle, because the court has to find, and there's a list of things there. I'm not going to read them out to you as much. It's just basically if they believe that the district's going to be feasible and beneficial to the area. And if they're satisfied with all that, the county commissioner's court grants the petition, officially fixes the boundaries. That's where they fix the boundaries for sure. And they order the election. And this is the important part that I want to get across, as well as it originates with the citizens, and it has to be verified and vetted and approved by the citizens. It's a grassroots entity, as I talked about in the very beginning. The county orders an election. This is the county election. Be sure and understand that. The public gets to vote on this, whether or not they want to be in an ESD. That's democracy for you. Now, there's a notice requirement. It's same as the petition. The election is held on the next uniform date. Now, this is important, and it's a little trick that got thrown in, or a little wrench that got thrown into things a couple of years ago. Texas now only has 2 uniform election dates, one in May and one in November. The November one, as I said, is coming up next week. In even-numbered years, there was a bill passed a couple of years ago that said you can't hold county elections in May of even-numbered years. Now, your ESD can hold an election if they're holding it by themselves, but obviously creation is a county election. So you can't hold county elections in even-numbered years because due to the primaries, basically, is the reason for that. I'll move on from that, but that's important because a lot of these folks I'm going to have to talk to, I've got to tell them that they can't go out for creation next May. Now you have to count the votes after the election, and that gets tricky if you had to deal with that little municipal consent monster that we talked about earlier. The district is created if the majority of the voters are in favor of it. Majority rule, it should work real easy, but there's a little loophole if there's a municipal consent problem. If your city or your city's ETJ is included, you've got to keep all those ballots separate. And it can be excluded if the vote fails, but passes overall. So basically, you can have a situation where the vote fails within one city, but it passes overall. You still have the ESD, and the city limits is excluded from the ESD. I believe we saw this just recently. I believe last May in Fort Bend County. I think that happened. In one of the recently created ESDs. So that can happen. Of course, if the city or ETJ where the vote fails is deemed essential to the feasibility of the ESD, then the ESD fails, which makes sense. I mean, you can't, and that's a county commissioner's determination. If the election fails, you have to wait 1 year to try again. Now, the next step in the process, the election is canvassed and the order creating the district is issued. That's your official birth date. The form of the order is prescribed in the statute. This is done by the county commissioners. It's an order of the county commissioner's court. It should be filed with the county along with all your other documentation. Now, I can't stress this enough. I've had to go to county courthouses and look up information when we're trying to do research, trying to get information for the legislature about how many ESDs were created like this, what timelines of ESDs. I've had to search through documents, and some county courthouses don't have stuff about their ESD because they were created a long time ago or just the records weren't kept correctly. You want to keep everything in one place and have it on file with the county clerk because that is your birth certificate. That is your birth certificate. The petition and the order creating the canvassing order showing the district passed and the order creating the district, that's what makes you you as an ESD. It's like the articles of incorporation for a business. So after all that, you're created. But there's more, as we all know. So, getting started. ESD governance. Real quickly. ESDs are governed by a board of 5 commissioners. Now, in most counties and in most areas of the state, they're appointed by the county commissioners court. In Harris, Orange, and Smith counties, and ESDs that exist in multiple counties, which there's only about 7 of those, ESD commissioners are elected. Now, since those are very specific statutes, now Harris, Orange, and Smith County, the default, it should be understood, is appointment. That is the default. Harris, Orange, and Smith counties were made elected by an act of the legislature that was specifically, as we call it, bracketed or specifically targeted at those counties. So those are the counties that have elected commissioners. I'm not going to talk too much about those because, again, the default is appointment, and there's some different rules that go on along with being an elected commissioner. I'm not going to get too much into that right now. Appointed commissioners serve 2-year staggered terms. Now, there's in the Health and Safety Code, the Commissioners Court shall consider relevant factors in determining the individuals for appointment as emergency services commissioners, including whether the individuals have knowledge that relates to the fire prevention or emergency medical services. So that's pretty much all the guidance the law gives you. Safety has created a guide, and maybe I have one, but I didn't bring it in here with me. We have a little pamphlet that tells you that we created, that we take to these county judges and commissioners conventions, that basically gives tips on traits to consider, things to consider in providing or in picking your ESD commissioners. There are some disqualifiers. Dual office holding, for example. You can't serve 2 offices of emolument, which means offices that you can be paid for. We just lost a safety board off our board of directors, a safety director, because he's taking another office and he'll be missed. We are basically, you can't hold 2 offices of emolument, and you can't have nepotism, which means the county commissioners court can't appoint a relative to serve on that ESD board. So there's a few legal disqualifiers, but mostly in terms of who to pick, we don't have a lot of guidance. Safety has tried to step in there. We try to tell people to avoid conflicts of interest. If you're dealing with someone who's going to have a real property interest, with somebody who owns land, I guess, there are different rules, conflict of interest rules that apply there. Business entity interests. The dangers of self-dealing are really our problem here, and the important thing to remember, the one I want to hit big time here, is when you have someone who's on your service provider serving on the ESD board, that's where you get into that dangers of self-dealing. People have to start recusing themselves from votes and from discussion on issues because they serve two hats. They serve on the service provider, but they also serve on the ESD board. And that's the kind of conflict of interest that we want to avoid. We usually say maybe not a good idea to appoint those folks. It's not bad to have someone who works with a different service provider. We've seen a fire chief from another area serve on an ESD board where he might live. That kind of thing is sometimes done. But in terms of, you want to avoid self-dealing and having conflicts of interest. There's a lot on conflicts of interest out there that I'm not going to get into the details right now, but those are things to look out for. You have to take your oaths of office, your sworn statements, and you have to get Open Meetings and Public Information Act training. Now, this is a state requirement. Every ESD commissioner, being a local government official, has to take, one time only, but you have to take it within 90 days of taking your office. And it can be taken online through the AG's office. If you haven't taken that and you've been in office for longer than 90 days, as soon as this webcast is over, go to the AG's website and take that training. It only takes a couple hours. We also offer it at our safety annual conference. That annual conference, including this year, is usually within 90 days of January 1st when most appointments are made. So you can get it at the safety conference if you're appointed on Jan 1. If you have any new folks coming onto the board on January 1st, I strongly recommend you telling them to come to the safety conference and get their open meetings public information training. You also have to elect your officers, president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and assistant treasurer. So let's talk for a moment about accountability. Your ESD board, now prior to June 17th, 2011, we had no real training requirement. Now, most of you know about the training requirement. You're sitting through training as we speak. The reason that came about, again, in that Senate Bill 917, is because we had folks that not all, but a few bad apples out there that were causing some bad headlines, and the legislature was angry. A few legislators in particular were very angry. And so they demanded there be accountability for ESD commissioners. And one of our suggestions was, hey, what about having some training that kind of instructs people on how to run their ESD? So, in Senate Bill 917, there is a requirement that you obtain at least 6 hours of certified continuing education at least once in a 2-year period. And you can carry forward 3 of those years if you go over. A lot of people, if you come to our conferences, for instance, you can get 12, 14 hours sometimes in a couple days. So if you get your 6 hours for 2 years and you can carry over 3. The training must be certified by an Institute of Higher Learning. That's defined in a statute, I believe the Education Code. Institute of Higher Learning is a defined statutory term. It can't just be your buddy's driving school or whatever. It might be, he might be an Institute of Higher Learning, but it's not necessarily true. There's a statutory defined definition. As I said at the beginning of this webcast and all of our training to date has been sponsored and certified by the V.G. Young Institute for County Government, which is part of Texas A&M. So that's why I said hello to College Station. They do a great job. They also do the training for county judges and commissioners. Those folks are required to get something like 25 hours a year or something. I'm not an expert on what their training requirements are, but county judges and commissioners have to get more training for their jobs. And V.G. Young does that training, and that's why SAFE-D chose to partner with V.G. Young. They're an Institute of Higher Learning as defined by the statute. So that's where the 6 hours of training came from, one of which you're getting as we speak. What kind of training? Now, again, I don't want to bore you with bill numbers that you're not going to have to remember, but House Bill 1619 was filed as a companion to Senate Bill 917. Companion just means it was basically the same bill, same idea. It had some different language because bills, as they go through the process, get amended and things get taken out, things get revised. It dropped out of 917 at some point, but in 1619 in the House bill, it provided specific topics for training. You can look at some. It's basically how to govern your district. District responsibility, board responsibilities, local government administration, ethics laws. We do ethics at our conferences, and we have an ethics online that you could take right now after this training. Governance and management of emergency services. That's now House Bill 1619 didn't pass, unlike Senate Bill 917. So basically, you got the training requirement in 917, but you didn't get these specific topics, which is okay because SAFE-D uses these topics to kind of use as a guideline for what we create, how we create our programs. So if you'll notice, that's kind of what we use, and we try to use this going forward to create our training. Now, something nobody really likes to talk about, removal of ESD commissioners. This was a big topic coming up in Senate Bill 917, and I'm fond of saying that one of the things we were facing in that 2011 legislative session was legislators wanted to have ad hoc removal of ESD commissioners, ad hoc removal of ESD commissioners without notice, without any sort of due process. Basically, there was a bill proposed that did that from an ESD from a legislator whose county commissioners were very, very upset with some bad stuff that their ESDs had done. So we sort of went through the process of negotiating, and this is what came of it. You can be removed for incompetency, misconduct, and official misconduct. Those are all defined terms by the law. Now, elected commissioners are a little different. Appointed commissioners are removed by the county commissioners court after a hearing. Elected commissioners must be removed by the DA. It's a separate process. I believe that elected commissioners can also be removed for intoxication. There's that added in. That's a separate process. I don't want to muddy the waters too much. Those are all defined things. Incompetency, misconduct, and official misconduct are all defined terms in the government code and the local government code. Failure to maintain those training requirements counts as incompetency for removal. So if you don't have your 6 hours, you can be removed. Now, I've been told by my production team that I need to clarify. You only can carry forward 3 hours if you get more than 6 hours a year, in a 2-year period. So if you get 6 hours, that satisfies your requirement for that 2 years. If you can go over if you go over that 6 hours, then you get 3. So if you get 9 hours, you have 6 hours met for that 2-year period, and then you carry forward 3 to that next 2-year period. I hope that makes sense. Let's talk a little bit more about accountability. This was another thing that was put into place, Senate Bill 917, in an effort to appease some legislators and show accountability for ESDs. By June 1st of each year, an independent professional audit must be filed with the County Commissioners Court. Now, if it's not submitted by September 1st, and the county auditor hasn't been ordered to prepare it, the ESD president and treasurer are automatically removed. A lot of you know that who have been coming to ESD safety training before. They're automatically removed. That's a big deal. Get your audit done. That's all I'll have to say about that. I'm running a little short on time, I've been told. So I'm going to tell you that I'm okay, but I want to make sure you understand the audit is very important. It is how the taxpayers know what you're doing with your money. It is a key part of accountability for ESDs. There is an exception for our smaller ESDs out there. If you meet certain statutory exemptions, statutory criteria, you only have to file compiled financial statements. That's something that safety brought about because some of these ESDs that have $30,000, $50,000 in revenue a year, and they're trying to get as much as they can to our first responders, spending $5,000, $6,000 on a full-blown audit is taxing and in a lot of cases crippling. So there's an audit exemption that was put into place. It's an important accountability requirement. If you have any questions about the audit, please set that forth. Now, other reports and requirements. You must file an annual report with the Texas Department of Agriculture by January 1st of each year. Now that annual report, safety helps you out with that. We're going to be sending out stuff, I'm sure, anytime soon. You can file it with us. We have a deal with TDA that we collect some of those. You can go do it through the safety website, and we get those onto the TDA. But that's an important requirement that you have to do. You also have to get a federal tax EIN. That's something that some people overlook, but you are, as an entity, you're tax exempt because you're a government, but you have to get that tax EIN, that employer identification number, and the comptroller will assign a taxing unit ID number to you. That's just to keep you straight. That's sort of your social security number with the state. The EIN is your social security number with the feds, basically, if you're talking about a business or a person. More basics here. You must meet once a month. That's in the statute. You need to have a regular meeting. Set a regular meeting time, date, and location. You have to keep minutes and records. Any of your actions have to be recorded in minutes. You have to publish notice of creation of the district administrator, the location of the district administrative office within 60 days of commissioner qualification. Now, that's actually a requirement that you do that each January. So, but when you're getting started, it's within 60 days of the commissioners becoming qualified. Also, it's good to set rules of order. We just last month did a ESD on Robert's Rules. You need some rules of order for running your ESD board meeting. Again, you're running things like you're a government now. You need to run things like it. Fiscal concerns. You've got to establish a district fiscal year. Some people use a calendar year. It's up to you what you think is best. Some people, I think what works best is an October 1 to September 30th fiscal year. That's the year that coincides best sort of with your truth in taxation, your budget setting, and your tax. You're setting your tax rate, which we'll talk about in one sec. You also have to select a district depository, find a bank. You open the bank account and an investment account if that's necessary. That leads us to, where does all the money come from, and how does your ESD get it? Now, ESDs get their money from ad valorem property tax in a lot of cases. That was the basic way. It's the default way. You must set a budget and tax rate for the district. That's something you have to do. I've talked about the cap is 10 cents. That cap's not going anywhere anytime soon. A lot of you are bumping up against that 10-cent cap. We'll talk about that in a second. You'll need to become familiar with truth in taxation requirements. The comptroller has this truth in taxation that they help you with. They have a lot of stuff on their website. We've done various presentations, webcast. We've done a webcast that's available on our website, and we did it at the annual conference about truth in taxation requirements. It's a step-by-step process. The key dates to know are the budgets must be adopted by September 30th, and your tax rate must be adopted by September 30th or 60 days after the tax rolls are certified. I say that because sometimes what we've seen in Travis County where we are right now, sometimes the tax rolls don't get certified for a while, and they want to give you enough time to have your public hearing, which is one of the steps in truth in taxation. You have to get notice out of that public hearing. So you have 60 days after you get the certified tax rolls. You usually get those at the beginning of August. That's the way it's supposed to work. So for some ESDs that are bumping up against that property tax cap, a lot of them, or they just don't think that they can raise property taxes, a lot of them turn to sales tax. Now, sales tax in the statewide is capped at 8.25%. 6.25% of that goes to the state of Texas, no questions asked. 2% is available to local governments. Many local governments is what I have there in italics. And I say many because there can be conflicts with various local governments who are also collecting sales tax. There's a lot about sales tax. This is not a presentation about sales tax. We do those presentations. But it's important to know there's 2% available for local governments. You can share it. You can collect it. You can carve out areas that are already collecting sales tax. There's a lot of different steps in that process. We won't get too in-depth here, but you must hold an election. You can't just decide to collect sales tax. You must hold an election. It must be approved by the voters. Again, grassroots government, approval by the voters, local control is the key words we like to stress at Safety about ESDs. There's a large range of issues with that, and again, I'm not going to get into them. You can collect fees for services. You have to have an order that establishes the collection of fees for your services, but you can bill. Obviously, on the EMS side, there's a lot about this that you know, but you can bill for fire protection services. You can bill for calls, false alarm fees. There's a lot of different stuff there, a way to try to recoup some of your expenses. As we know, expenses are always growing. Now, what does the ESD actually do? Well, the number one thing is you're supposed to provide services. Now, the legislature has stated that in an ESD, the ESD is the primary entity responsible for the provision of emergency services. That means you've got the reign over emergency services in your territory. Now, there's multiple models for this. You can contract for services, which is what we see a lot of. Usually that's with an independent entity. You see a lot of these volunteer fire departments. Again, remember our original situation. In some cases, a volunteer fire department isn't getting the money. Their VFD, their volunteers are aging out. They can't get as many folks to volunteer. They need some paid staff. Their equipment is aging. But they're an independent entity. They're a 501c3 nonprofit in a lot of cases. So they contract with the ESD, and there's an entire process that you need to go through at arm's length to contract with the ESD. And we see some issues that get created with this, obviously. You have an adversarial, sometimes relationship that sets in. We hope not. It's important to keep everybody on the same page, but an ESD contracts with the local government. The local government pays them to provide services. But you are responsible for providing those services. There's the do-it-yourself model. We've seen a couple of folks go to this across the state, a couple of ESDs. What you see is they basically say, okay, that's it. We're going to hire the chief. We're going to take over the assets. We have the assets. We have the money. We're going to fund our fire department. I'm sitting in Travis County, ESD number 2, which is in Pflugerville. That is the way it works here. Travis County ESD number 2 is the Pflugerville Fire Department. They fund the fire department. The firefighters and the fire chief work for Travis County ESD number 2, along with administrative staff. That's something that we've seen some folks go to. I'm not making a recommendation on what works best, but that is another different model. You also, as an ESD, can contract for administration of the district, because as a local government, you need to have things all lined up. Good bookkeeper is worth their weight in gold. You also have to have that audit that we talked about, so you're going to have to engage in a contract for auditing services, legal services. If you're wondering, it's too late after the bad thing has happened to call the lawyer. I know they're expensive, trust me. I know, but a good ESD attorney can help a lot, save a lot of expenses down the road. Tax assessment and collection, you have to have a contract for that with the county tax assessor collector. And that's something, and then there are other services that the board can contract for as they see fit. You can have an administrator, an executive director if you think your district is big enough and needs that kind of thing. A lot of districts do. ESDs make capital expenditures. That's what some of our friends in the VFDs, their eyes get big when they start talking about creating an ESD. We'll finally have enough money to build that new station, or we'll finally have enough money to buy that new fire truck. Capital expenditures are a big function of what an ESD actually does, giving our first responders training, not just training, but money, but also equipment to do their job. You enter into a lot of agreements as an ESD entity: mutual aid agreements, agreements for dispatch, co-op purchasing such as buy board, HGAC. You also, if you're an EMS or you have a first responders who are subject to HIPAA, you're going to have some agreements there. These are all things that you need to work out as an ESD. There's a lot of fine print when you get to be an ESD. Broader ESD powers. You have a fire code. You can adopt a fire code. I'm sorry, I'm running a little late there. You can adopt a fire code, and you can consider fire marshal services. You can hire a peace officer to perform those services if there's no county fire marshal. That's just something, there's fireworks regulation powers in the statute. These are some more of the detailed powers. I won't spend too much time on that. You have some general responsibilities. You need insurance. There's a lot of good folks out there doing that. District needs insurance, obviously, but you also need directors and officers liability insurance. That's liability for you as the board. You're going to have to post a bond. That's required in statute. The county treasurer, or the ESD treasurer, has to have a bond on file with the county. The county judge generally determines that amount, or in statute, the county judge determines that amount. Record keeping, big part of things. We're trying to get our records retention. Person to maybe do a webcast. We're going to definitely have them at the conference. We just got it confirmed. Record retention is huge. You need to have a records management program. I can't stress that enough. There are legal requirements with the Public Information Act that you need to have certain records on file. And you want to have that records management program filed with the State Library and Archives Commission. They're great. They're a great bunch of people that do a lot of good work down there. So some common ESD issues that we run into as we're wrapping up here. Asset ownership, who owns what. We're actually seeing a court case play out over this issue in Harris County right now. HB 3798, which was passed, tried to clarify this a little bit, that things purchased wholly or partially with ESD funds are the property of ESD until the property is disposed by law. That's simple stuff. If you've ever come to our conference and heard Ken Campbell talk about Grandpa's Axe, he does a great job of basically saying, look, the ESD taxpayer money goes into it, it's the ESDs. That's the ESDs property. The taxpayers own it. And that's the thing that we have to remember. You are, as ESD commissioners, the stewards of the taxpayer money, and you have to safeguard that, and you have to safeguard the property that is the property that belongs to the taxpayers. We also see issues with multiple service providers. There's a lot of issues that come along with having multiple departments. Again, when you decide where your ESD is going to be, usually what we see is we see a VFD that just says, okay, well, our service area, that's going to be the ESD boundaries, which is fine, and that's how it works. Sometimes we see a couple of VFDs get together and decide to create an ESD over their collective service areas. I'll give you an example real quickly. Smith County, I believe they're watching up in Lindale right now. They're a single service provider. Lindale VFD is Smith County ESD number 1. But right across the county in Smith County ESD number 2, I believe they have something like 13 ESD providers, or 13 service providers, VFDs. That creates a whole different host of issues that we've seen. A lot of county-wide ESDs in North Texas, Johnson County, Hill County, have multiple ESD, multiple service providers. And one of the big things we're seeing on the horizon is conflicts with municipalities and economic development corporations. Since we're running short of time, I'll save all my stories about dealing with economic development corporations. But when sales tax gets involved, these local governments, as I alluded to earlier, want to capture some of that sales tax. And a lot of that gets into conflict with the ESD. We see some issues there. It's an issue on the horizon for the legislative session in 2017. So wrapping up here, I know I've run long. That's something to keep in mind. But I want to run through some ESD statistics real quick. There's 315 known ESDs in Texas. The tax rate is about all over the place, really. A third of us have a tax rate greater than 9 cents, which means they're right at that 10-cent cap. But a third are capped at about 3 cents, a lot of former RFPDs. So there's a wide spectrum. There's approximately 60 ESDs that collect sales tax now. 5 years ago, that number was maybe 10, a couple handfuls. So that's a growing thing as ESDs get more and more capped out and are looking for alternate sources of funding. The average taxable property value is around 1.5 billion with a B, but the median value is near 600 million for ESDs. That's the taxable property value. The property tax levy is about $1 million a year. That's the money coming into the district in property tax. But the median tax levy is only $370,000. Now, what those numbers tell you, don't worry about the numbers. What that tells you is there's a few big money ESDs that are on one end of the spectrum that tip the scales, but there's a wide range, and really we have a lower median that shows that some ESDs are not that big at all. And you can see that in my next bullet point. The annual property tax collections range from $11,000 in some areas to $17.5 million we saw in running. That's as much as a lot of municipal departments out there. So it's a huge gamut that we run with ESDs, leading to my next statistic. I've put it in here. It's the common refrain. If you've seen one ESD, you've seen one ESD. Very different situations all across the state. That's attributable to either former Safety President Don Grogg, John Carlton, Safety's Legislative Counsel, swears he made it up. So depending on who you talk to, that's the quote. We don't say this glibly. We say this to emphasize that there's a lot of different situations out there, and safety is trying to be the point of reference that brings us all together as ESDs, because we all are subject to the same laws, no matter what your ESD situation is. Safety, a little bit about safety really quickly. This is my last slide. The State Association of Fire Emergency Districts, we're a nonprofit 501c6 professional association. We're an independent entity. We are not part of the government. We have a deal with TDA to kind of help with ESD outreach, because TDA, Texas Department of Agriculture, while does not have any money to appropriate by the legislature for ESD oversight, ESD or safety began as an information exchange for ESDs. Basically, in the late 90s, people were sitting around saying, how do we talk to each other? We have this ESD. We don't know what to do. How did you guys solve this problem that we're facing? It's an information exchange, and safety grew organically out of that. It's a grassroots entity in and of itself. And we're dedicated to helping ESDs all around the state. We do training, annual conferences, regional workshops, remote webcasts, hello, like this one. We also do legislative advocacy, and I do want to stress this to some of y'all out there, because some of you say, well, you know, I'm not interested in politics, I'm not interested in the legislature, I don't care about any of that. That's great. You just want to help your community, and that's what you should be doing. You just want to help your first responders have what they need to get the job done. But unfortunately, or fortunately, ESDs are subject to laws. And those laws are made by the folks at that big pink building in downtown Austin. And we need to talk to them about what ESDs actually face, what ESDs are. So this kind of information, and that's part of what ESDs do, is paying some folks with the experience down there to get the message across, and the relationships down there to make things better for ESDs. I think I'm out of time. That's pretty much it, right, guys? So thank you so much. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions for tonight. We have a few. We'll try to answer those individually. But I've already run you so long, and I want to get you your credit form. So please, if you have questions, there's my information on the screen. If we can put that back up real quick, please give me your thoughts on this presentation. This is the first time I've ever done this specific presentation. You all were the guinea pigs. I'm sure I left stuff out. I'm sure I may have said something that you didn't agree with. Please let me know. We're all ears. We just want to make this better for all of us out there in the ESD world, and hopefully make things better for those future ESDs that are coming on the line.